Vikings didn't fear death, but they feared them. The world trembled at the Norse axe, but the Viking trembled at the whisper of the snow. There was a tribe that didn't conquer lands, but minds. Beings who, according to the Sagas, could stop your heart from miles away and steal your soul without leaving a single wound. Who were the Ice Invisibles that forced history's most violent warriors to pay tribute out of pure terror? Stay tuned, because the history you know is about to freeze. This is the Immortals, where legends never die. Subscribe and take your place in the ranks of legends. Immortals, forget the glory of battle. Forget the Valhalla you've been told. Beneath the blood-stained ice of the north lies a nightmare the Vikings couldn't kill. They sailed into Finnmörk as conquerors, only to find they were nothing but prey. This wasn't a clash of cultures. This was a collision between mortal steel and an ancient, faceless hunger. The Vikings dominated the earth, but the Sámi owned the darkness itself. To the Norse, they weren't just neighbors. They were breathing curses, entities that could unweave your mind and leave your body a hollow shell before you even saw their face. Prepare yourself. You are about to enter the only kingdom the Vikings were too terrified to claim. Crossing the Arctic Circle wasn't a journey into another land. It was a descent into another plane of existence, a realm where your steel was useless and your courage was a liability. To the Vikings, the map of the world ended at the edge of the Scandinavian mountains. Beyond that lay Finnmörk. But this wasn't just a place of snow. It was the birthplace of the Jötnar, the frost giants. For a Norse warrior, entering this territory meant leaving the protection of their gods behind. They believed the cold here wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a living, breathing extension of the Sámi will. In Finnmörk, the wind didn't blow. It hunted. The ice didn't freeze. It paralyzed. The Vikings were convinced the Sámi could command the very atoms of the north, turning the landscape into a sentient weapon. While the Norse built long ships to conquer the tides, the Sámi moved through the blizzard as if the frost itself were their skin. In this kingdom of white shadows, the Viking axe, the world's most feared weapon, became nothing more than a heavy piece of useless iron. But the true terror was etched into the very maps they sailed by. Ancient Norse charts didn't just end in the north. They stopped abruptly with warnings of the end of reason. It is a documented psychological phenomenon that Viking sailors, known for their legendary bravery, developed an absolute taboo. While navigating the northern seas, they refused to look directly at the northern horizon. They believed that staring too long into that endless, shifting white void would allow the Sámi to catch their gaze from hundreds of miles away, pulling their consciousness out of their bodies and leaving them adrift. They didn't fear the monsters in the water. They feared the gaze of the men on the ice. They sailed blind, staring at their feet, praying that the masters of the north wouldn't notice their presence. Because in Finnmörk, the moment you were seen, you were already lost. What use is the finest ashwood shield, or a mail shirt forged by the greatest smiths, against an arrow you cannot see, because it is fired directly from the mind? For the Viking warrior, war was physical, steel against steel, flesh against wood. But in the frozen silence of the north, combat was invisible. This is where the terrifying concept of the Gand begins. This wasn't a shaft of wood tipped with iron. It was a pure projectile of psychic energy, a focused curse launched by a Noaidi, a Sámi shaman. These shamans didn't need to close the distance. They didn't need a yew-bow. They would sit before their sacred drums, enter a deep trance, and release an invisible strike capable of causing instant paralysis, blindness, or sudden cardiac arrest. The warrior would collapse where he stood without a scratch, without a single drop of blood visible on his body. His Hamingja, his luck or guardian soul, had been shattered by a force he couldn't comprehend. It was the ultimate form of psychological warfare, practiced centuries before the world even had a name for it. The most chilling record of this power is found in the Saga of St. Olaf, a foundational text of Norse history. It chronicles how the king's most ferocious warriors, men who had survived the bloodiest battles in Europe, found themselves utterly incapable of fighting. They admitted that, in the presence of the Sámi, their muscles simply refused to obey. Their arms literally turned to stone. Modern anthropologists now look at these accounts as an extreme form of Arctic hysteria or polar panic, a collective psychosomatic response induced by sheer, primal terror. The Vikings didn't surrender out of weakness. They surrendered because their own bodies, seized by Sámi suggestion, became their worst enemies. The ultimate weapon of the North wasn't the sword. It was the total paralysis of the enemy's will. But if they could paralyze an army on land, imagine what they could do when the Vikings dared to sail through their frozen seas. The Vikings were the masters of the sea, but the Sámi were the masters of the wind that moved their ships. To the Northmen, the ocean was a highway. To the Sámi, it was a gate they could lock at will. Imagine the world's most elite navigators, men who crossed the Atlantic without a compass, reduced to beggars. This was the reality in the Arctic waters. The Vikings believed the Sámi possessed a terrifying monopoly over the weather. This led to the dark trade of the 3 knots. Norse captains would pay fortunes in silver, gold, and blood for a simple leather cord tied with 3 enchanted knots. Untying the first brought a gentle breeze, the second, a powerful gale. But the third? The third was said to unleash a cataclysmic hurricane that would rip the masts from the deck and drag the ship into the crushing depths. The Vikings didn't see this as a superstition. They saw it as a life insurance policy. They understood that in the far north, your survival didn't depend on your skill with the rudder, but on your standing with the shaman who owned the air you breathed. While the sagas often speak of successful trades, there is a much darker side to this history that is rarely mentioned. There are chilling records of entire Viking fleets, hundreds of hardened warriors, found drifting as ghost ships, their timbers rotting in the salt water. These weren't victims of battle or storms. They were victims of silence. Because no Sámi shaman would grant them the price of the wind, these fleets became trapped in endless dead calms. They were stranded in sight of their own coastlines, unable to move a single mile. They rotted and starved to death just days away from their homes, watching their families' fires on the horizon, dying not by the sword, but because the masters of the North simply refused to let the wind blow for them. It was the ultimate demonstration of power, killing an army by doing absolutely nothing. But the Sámi didn't just stop your ships. They could enter your mind while you slept, turning your own dreams into a battlefield where you had already lost. A berserker's greatest fear wasn't dying a warrior's death in battle. It was waking up in his own tent the next morning, looking at his hands, and not remembering who he was, his identity erased. For the Vikings, physical defense was second nature, but they had no armor for their minds. This was the Sámi's true battlefield, a dimension of terror. The shamans practiced a terrifying form of astral projection, known in the Norse world as bilocation. While their physical bodies lay in a deep, trance-like sleep back in their camps, their shadow spirits, or fetches, would travel as wolves or silent ravens, easily infiltrating the secure perimeters of the Viking camps. They weren't there to kill the body. They were there to assassinate the mind. Their ultimate goal was to steal the Hamingja, the essential luck, life force, and ancestral soul that defined a warrior's identity and lineage. If a chieftain lost his Hamingja, he lost everything. He might still breathe and walk, but he was a hollow man, a walking corpse with cold glass eyes, utterly incapable of fighting or leading his men. It was a fate considered infinitely worse than an honorable death by the sword in Valhalla. The pervasive fear of this soul theft is documented in a ritual found in the Helgakvida Sagas, confirming the sheer paranoia of the time. The Jarls developed specific, desperate nightly rituals. They would sleep with intricate iron amulets and powerful circles of forged metal surrounding their heads, believing the iron could create a vital psychic barrier. They thought these cold metal rings would physically block the incorporeal Sámi spirits from entering their minds and extracting their memories and life force during the night. They weren't just protecting themselves from an assassin with a knife. They were protecting their very existence from a nightmare that literally walked while they slept. It's the clearest proof that the Norse believed the Sámi had complete mastery over a dark, supernatural world beyond their comprehension. But the Sámi didn't just haunt their minds in the dark. In the light of day, they could disappear in plain sight, becoming ghosts that moved faster than the eye could follow. Do not fear the army that screams its war cry. Fear the shadow that moves at 40 kilometers per hour across the tundra without breaking a single crystal of ice. To a Viking warrior, war had a weight. It was the weight of a heavy iron mail shirt, a solid oak shield, and boots that sank deep into the unforgiving snow. They were slow, grounded, and loud. Then, from the white haze of the north, they saw them, the Skridfinns. To the Norse eye, the Sámi didn't look like men. They looked like spirits defying the laws of gravity. Using primitive but highly effective ski technology, an invention the Vikings had never mastered for combat, the Sámi could glide across the deep powder as if they were weightless. While a Viking war party was struggling to move through knee-deep drifts, a single Sámi scout could circle their entire perimeter in seconds, silent as a falling flake. They attacked from angles that shouldn't exist, striking with lethal precision before vanishing back into the blizzard. For the Vikings, this wasn't just superior equipment, it was a violation of reality. They saw men flying over the snow, moving faster than a horse could gallop on solid ground. And they concluded that no mortal could possess such speed unless they were woven into the wind itself. The cultural shock of seeing the Sámi on skis was so profound that it birthed one of the strangest and most unsettling superstitions in Viking history. Many Norsemen genuinely believed that the Sámi were not born with human feet, but with supernatural wooden limbs that allowed them to walk upon the clouds of snow. This belief led to a bizarre and tragic tactical error in the northern forests. Chroniclers note that Viking sentries, paralyzed by the myth of the Skridfinns, would often spend their watch looking up into the trees or towards the horizon line, convinced their enemies would arrive from the air or glide above the ground. They were so terrified of the men with wooden feet that they stopped looking at the ground beneath them, only to realize too late that the shadow they saw wasn't a bird or a cloud, but a Sámi hunter who had already closed the distance in total silence. The Vikings soon realized that you cannot conquer a ghost. So, the most brutal raiders in history were forced to do something they never did for anyone else. They chose to pay for their lives. The Vikings granted mercy, sometimes, but only to those they were simply too terrified to touch. Their greatest humiliation wasn't a battlefield defeat. It was the forced shame of paying protection money to the very ghosts they intended to conquer. The Viking worldview was straightforward. If a people possessed wealth, you took it by force. They raided churches for gold, enslaved populations for labor, and extorted tribute from weaker kingdoms across Europe. But with the Sámi, the rules of their violent world were flipped upside down. This was the Finnskatt, the Finnish tax. To the outside world, it was recorded as a mundane tax on northern furs. But to the Viking jarls who paid it, it was something far darker. It was an enforced peace offering, a chilling price to avert the unleashing of Sámi magic. The Vikings would hand over their finest gold, their forged iron, and their silver, not to buy goods, but to purchase their own spiritual survival. It was a tribute paid by the apex predators to their prey, a silent, shameful admission that steel had limits that the sorcery of the ice could bypass. In the eyes of the proud Norsemen, this was the ultimate soul-crushing humiliation. The most damning record of this submission is found in the history of Harald Fairhair, the great unifier of Norway. Harald's saga recounts that, to secure a lasting peace and to acquire mystical leverage, he married Snefrithr, the daughter of a Sámi leader. This was no romantic alliance. It was a desperate attempt to bind a power the Vikings couldn't defeat with axes. The other jarls viewed this act as a profound national disgrace. Their warrior king had debased his bloodline by joining with a heathen sorceress. It is the starkest proof that the Sámi were so overwhelming that the most brutal ruler in Norway had to humble himself, not with a sword, but with a wedding ring. If kings had to purchase peace with their own honor, imagine the power the Sámi held over the very threads of fate. A power contained within one terrifying object, the sacred drum. A single strike on a shaman's drum in the deep Arctic could make a king in England fall dead from his horse. This wasn't music. It was the sound of fate being rewritten in real time. To the Vikings, time was a web woven by the Norns, but the Sámi held the loom. Their ultimate weapon was the Mjavresgari, the sacred runic drum. While the Norsemen prayed to Odin for victory, the Sámi Noaidi sat in the freezing dark and commanded it. This drum wasn't a musical instrument. It was a medieval quantum tool for reality manipulation. It was decorated with intricate symbols representing the cosmos, the gods, and the fragile lives of men. By placing a brass ring on the drum's skin and striking it with a hammer of reindeer antler, the shaman didn't just predict what would happen. He decided it. The vibrations of the drum were believed to vibrate the very fabric of existence. If the shaman wanted a Viking fleet to vanish in the fog, he played the rhythm of the mist. If he wanted a jarl's heart to stop in the heat of battle, he struck the symbol of the warrior's soul. For the Vikings, the sound of a distant Sámi drum was more terrifying than the roar of 1,000 enemies, because they knew that once the rhythm began, their fate was no longer in their own hands. The sheer terror inspired by these drums was so profound and long-lasting that it transcended the Viking age. Centuries later, as Christianity moved north, the church identified the Sámi drums as the most dangerous technology on earth, not because they were heathen, but because they truly believed in their power to alter reality. In an unprecedented campaign of spiritual genocide, the church ordered the absolute destruction of every Mjavresgari under penalty of death. Shamanes were burned alive alongside their instruments in a desperate attempt to silence the voice of the North. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of these drums were confiscated and thrown into the flames. Today, out of a history that once dominated the Arctic, only about 70 original drums survive in European museums, the silent remnants of a power that once made the most brutal conquerors in history tremble in their boots. But the Sámi didn't just kill their enemies with sound. They could infiltrate the very skin of the wild, becoming the beasts that haunted the Viking camps at night. Never attack a wolf in the north. You might be wounding the very man you tried to negotiate with this morning. In the lands of ice, the skin you see is rarely the true form of your enemy. To a Viking, a warrior was a man. He could be brutal or possessed by the berserker rage, but he remained human. In Sámi territory, that logic shattered. The Norse lived in absolute terror of Hamingja, the shifting of shapes. They swore that Sámi shamans didn't need armies because they could project their consciousness into the Arctic's apex predators. Imagine a Viking camp in the dead of the eternal night. There are no war cries, only the sound of claws on ice. A massive bear or a wolf with unnervingly intelligent eyes emerges from the blizzard, tearing through sentries and vanishing before an axe can be raised. The Vikings believed these weren't hungry animals, but the Sámi will manifest it in flesh and fang. This was supernatural guerrilla warfare, where the enemy used no steel, only the raw power of nature controlled by a human mind. For a warrior seeking glory in Valhalla, dying under the claws of a beast possessed by a man's spirit was the ultimate dishonor and a nightmare beyond comprehension. The most chilling proof of this power wasn't found in the heat of battle, but in the trail left behind. Nordic chronicles contain harrowing accounts of hunts that ended in psychological ruin. They tell of warriors who managed to plunge an iron spear into one of these demon bears. Following the heavy trail of blood across the snow, they expected to find a carcass. Instead, the blood led them directly to an isolated Sámi tent. Inside, they would find an old man sitting in absolute silence, seemingly untouched and having never left his hearth. But as they watched, the old man would begin to bleed profusely from his side, in the exact spot where the Viking spear had pierced the beast's flesh hours before. This transferred wound confirmed the Vikings' deepest fear. They weren't fighting men, but entities whose essence was tethered to the wild itself. But there was something worse than being hunted by a beast. It was surviving the encounter and returning home, only to realize you no longer owned your own spirit. Returning from the northern lands was far worse than dying within them. You could come back with your body intact, without a single scar, but your soul remained forever trapped within the ice of Finnmörk. In the Viking world, survival was the ultimate goal, but for those who dared to challenge the Sámi and lived to tell the tale, life became a life sentence. The sagas speak of warriors who returned from Arctic expeditions in a state of permanent catatonia. In the settlements, they were known as the Hollow Ones. These were not common war wounds. Their eyes, once filled with the fury of the north, were now empty glass, staring toward a horizon that no one else could see. They no longer spoke. They did not eat by their own will, and they did not recognize their wives or children. The Vikings believed that contact with Sámi magic was so corrosive that it simply erased the individual's humanity. Post-northern trauma was not seen as a mental injury, but as a spiritual theft. The warrior was physically there, but his Hamingja, his vital essence, had been devoured by the shaman's silence. They were living reminders that, against the Sámi, physical victory was irrelevant if your mind was destroyed in the process. The terror inspired by these survivors was so profound that Viking communities developed an extreme and brutal practice. Because of the belief in bilocation and astral spying, the Vikings did not see these men as victims, but as Trojan horses. They believed the Sámi had emptied the warrior to use his body as a vessel, or a portal, allowing the shaman's spirit to observe the interior of Viking villages through the eyes of the returned man. For this reason, symbolic killing rituals existed for these survivors. They were legally declared dead, stripped of their names, and in some cases, buried in effigy to break the link with the North. They were men who walked among the living, but whom no one dared to look in the eye, for fear that it was a Sámi looking back. For a Viking, it was better to be buried with honor after a battle than to return as a shadow inhabited by the enemy. It was this terror of the void that finally forced the only possible conclusion. After centuries of fear, the Vikings learned the most important lesson. There are enemies you don't defeat with steel. You defeat them with respect. The Vikings vanished from history. Their kingdoms crumbled, and their fire burned out. But the people who made them tremble, the masters of the ice, are still living in the exact same place today. History remembers the Vikings through runes carved in stone and sagas of their vast voyages. They built empires from the rivers of Russia to the shores of North America. But the true measure of their power isn't found in what they conquered, but in what they were forced to leave untouched. The Sámi didn't need to build longships or fleeting empires. Their resistance was immobility. Their victory was remaining unalterable, rooted to a land that the Vikings considered too dangerous to inhabit. While the Norse world Christianized, settled, and eventually faded into modern history, the Sámi continued their rituals, their control of the wind, and their mastery of the spirits. They survived Viking brutality through intelligence, magic, and an unbreakable connection to the environment that turned them into ghosts. They didn't win a war with an army. They won by being invincible within their own realm, proving that brute force always finds its limit against the edge of the unknown. The legacy of this resistance is more than just history. It is etched into biology itself. Modern genetic science has discovered that Sámi DNA is one of the oldest and purest lineages remaining in Europe, an anthropological mystery that defies explanation. They survived massive migrations, Viking expansion, and centuries of colonization without significantly mixing with their southern neighbors. This is the ultimate proof of their success. They maintained a near-total cultural and physical isolation, defending their territory and identity in a way no other people on Earth could achieve. They didn't need to fire a single metal arrow. Their greatest weapon was a wall of silence and a genetic fortress that remains intact today. They are the true Immortals of the North, standing silent where the most feared warriors in history once fell to their knees in prayer. The next time you think of history's ultimate warrior, remember the man who dared to look north, felt the cold, and chose to turn back. Immortals. The Vikings wrote their name in blood, but the Sámi wrote theirs in the very wind. Even the most feared warriors in history had someone to fear. If you felt the chill of this story, hit the like button and comment "ice" below to show your strength. Don't stop here. If you want to see who the Vikings prayed to while hiding from the shadows, watch our latest video, Top 10 Most Powerful Nordic Gods, Beyond the Myths, available now.